Hello, I'm Mary Pat Campbell, FSA, which is Fellow of the Society of Actuaries, and MAAA, member of the American Academy of Actuaries. I'm going to go through a selection of my slides, U.S. mortality trends through the pandemic. I had presented this, you see it says May 10th, 2022. I presented this to the Actuaries Club of Hartford and Springfield on that date. I'm assuming some of the people watching this may be actuaries, but most of you are not. You may be wondering, what is an actuary? Well, I'm an actuary. Trust me, I'm an actuary. To be specific, I'm a life actuary. Actuaries quantify risk, and we do other things with risk as well, but specifically non-financial risk. And being a life actuary, I look at mortality risk, or I count dead people. So I'm going to be looking at mortality trends. I'm going to assume people are not actuaries or not life actuaries. So I am going to adjust how I'm presenting this in this video compared to how I gave it to the Actuaries Club. So there's four main areas I'm going to be talking about. The first area is not a huge amount, but I will explain a little bit of what the actuarial interest is. There is a business side. So why do actuaries do this? It's because we get paid. This isn't a hobby. There is a business side to this. I'm going to look at the total deaths and mortality rates for the U.S., so all causes. Then we're going to split it into two main areas, COVID and non-COVID. Okay, so U.S. life insurance impact, and I'm going to talk a little bit about other insurances as well. Okay. We're interested in mortality in general because for life insurance, it doesn't matter if you died of COVID or something else, dead is dead. They're going to pay out no matter what you died from. So we have been trying to war game this. In 2020, the initial way that actuaries were looking at it is what scenario are we looking at? Is this going to be like the Spanish flu pandemic, which was much worse in terms of mortality rate impact? Even if the numbers were lower in total, the U.S. population was also much lower. And also the base mortality rates at the time were higher than what we're used to now. So that was the Spanish flu pandemic. We also had a couple of flu pandemics mid-20th century, the Hong Kong flu and the Asian flu, which were actually pretty bad as well. And those had different impacts by age. So one of them was a little more severe on younger ages, and others were more severe on older ages. We've had the first SARS. If you remember, COVID is actually like a SARS-2, electric boogaloo. So they were looking at what kind of mortality stress scenario and will we get, they were thinking it'll be over in a year. Well, it's over 2 years later. We know it's not over in a year, and we keep getting variants. So the question is, will there be a return to normal? Will COVID eventually just fade away and go away? Will it be part of a seasonal mix, just like we have with flu? We get flu every year, and it adds to extra mortality, and we will see that in some of the graphs, that there's extra mortality basically every winter. It goes up in the winter, it goes down in the summer, and that's mainly older people dying of flu and pneumonia. And then maybe we'll just have heightened mortality for a certain number of years, and it will tail off. So we kind of have the short-term mortality stress. Maybe there's a medium-term response and a longer term. And we care about, of course, life insurance. So we have to pay out a certain amount of money when people die. And that can be group life insurance, like the employee benefits coverage you might get, which is usually like 1 times your salary, or maybe you have like a $50,000 policy, or maybe like a burial policy, $10,000 through an employer. Those tend to be fairly inexpensive coverage because it's people who are actively working and they tend to be younger. So that's group life. There's individual life. So you go out and that could be a term life, like a 10-year policy, or a permanent life, like whole life or universal life. And those pay out when you die. But there's other kind of coverages that are affected by these mortality trends, such as A&H, which is accident and health, disability coverage, long-term care coverage. These are affected in different ways. Now, you may have heard of long COVID, so maybe someone gets disabled by a long bout of COVID. We don't know, but also there may be, I'm sorry to say, this happened with the nursing homes, that someone who would have otherwise lived for a long time in a nursing home died a little sooner because they died of COVID. So these are all effects that affect the insurance industry, and actuaries help. We do try to figure out the mortality rates, try to project the directions that they may go, and then, of course, what the economic impact will be on the insurance company. So from an insurance company point of view, we care about the total mortality, all-cause mortality trends. So I'm going to start out with the very high-level mortality rates. And this is the entire U.S. population. I have two lines here. Let me get my cursor here so you can see. The dark blue, this is the crude rate. Crude rate is total number of deaths divided by the population. Now, if you want to see what the scale is, this is a rate per 100,000. So at the 1,000, so 1,000 is 1% of the population. So in 2020, we exceeded 1% of the population dying. That's the crude rate. Now, the problem with using a crude rate for your mortality rate measurement, as it were, is that as the population gets older, obviously, you're expecting more of your population to die. Older people die at higher rates. So to try to capture, how mortality trends are going without capturing how the population is aging, we use what's called an age-adjusted rate. And that's where we re-weight the mortality rates by, we basically force it into an age distribution so that it's the same each year. And so we have standardized age weights. And it's about a year 2000, but you'll see it doesn't quite match up. So we're trying to make it match a year 2000. It really matches around 2003, and there's a timing issue, whatever. But it doesn't really matter if we use an age-adjusted rate or a crude rate. From 2019 to 2020, there was about a 17% to 18% increase in the death rates. Yes, most of that is COVID, but it still continued to get worse in 2021. So from 2020 to 2021, it increased an additional 2 to 3%. So I wanted to graph, and this is where I pushed it back to 2018 so you could see the seasonality. So it goes wee up and down and up and down. So I did an average deaths per day by month, and I did 2018 and 2019. So most of the time when I'm doing 2020 and 2021, I'm going to be comparing it against 2019. 2019 was a boring year for mortality. Nothing particularly special was going on. I am including 2018 because 2017 to 2018, that winter was a bad flu season. Do you remember that? It was, and it did affect life insurance, by the way. It tends to affect group life more than individual life because of how these things are priced. But you'll notice, again, it tends to peak in like January, February, and then comes down, and you have your lowest death rates or deaths per day in the summer, and then comes up again. But you can see our various COVID waves. I'm doing it by month, and you can see the peak in April 2020. But the real COVID peak was January 2021, and you can kind of see, I didn't mark it here, but the Delta wave, September 2021, and some Omicron. Because of the timing, so I pulled this data at the beginning of May. I got the May date. Most of these data got pulled on May 6th and May 7th. And yes, I did the talk on May 10th, so that gives you an idea. So there still is a lag between when deaths occur, when they're reported locally to the county medical examiners, and then when they get reported to the CDC, and then when they get into this database, which is CDC Wonder. And then the CDC Wonder database gets updated monthly. So there can be a little bit of deaths missing from the end of the year, but for the most part, the total number of deaths are there for 2021. It just might be a few that are missing for 2021. 2020 and before are completed. Mostly. There might be a few, corrections over the years, but it's going to be minimal. It's not material, as we say. The ones for 2021, there may still be some material changes, mainly for cause of death, and we'll talk more about that. Most of the analysis you're going to be seeing in these slides are going to be by age group. I am going to be sharing a link with you in the video description, or if you get this on my blog, or on a tweet, I'll have a link to the Dropbox that has all the spreadsheets, or to the slides. There are 75 slides in this deck. I'm not going to go over every slide, but almost all of the slides have graphs that are by age group, because age is the biggest factor for death rates. Most natural causes have increasing death rates by age, and we'll see a particular pattern that happens time and again. To begin with, I want to talk about the total number of deaths, and I'm just doing 2020 and 2021 against 2019, and I'm just looking at the number of deaths, so it's just doing a subtraction. Okay, so the light blue is 2021 and the dark blue is 2020. For all of the age groups under age 80, we saw that there were more deaths for that age group in 2021 compared to 2019. So, compared to 2020, okay? So compared to 2019, all the age groups, and we're ignoring the kids, by the way, so some of these are negative. They're really immaterial down here for the kids. We're just looking at the adults. All of them had more deaths in 2020 and 2021 than 2019. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about 2021 versus 2020. So in 2021, there were more deaths in 2020 for under age 80. For over age 80, they had fewer deaths in 2021 than 2020. There's a lot of different reasons this can happen. Now, you could be somewhat optimistic and say, well, the oldest people got COVID vaccines first. Therefore, when COVID came through in 2021, multiple times again, they were less likely to get COVID, less likely to die from COVID, yada, yada. That's explanation number one. Explanation number two. Explanation number two is the dry tinder, in that, of course, the COVID death rates for the oldest age groups in 2020 were pretty horrific, and especially through the nursing homes, and they basically died in 2020, so they weren't around to die. The most vulnerable weren't around to die in 2021. They already died, and so therefore fewer of them were around to die, and we'll be looking at rates in a moment. So, the more hardy old folks were around in 2021 were less likely to die. That's explanation number two. So there's, different ways you can interpret the data. Just looking at the numbers are not going to tell you why it happened this way. Okay, and I can come up with crazier explanations than that. So, just keep in mind, when I look at these, I'm never looking at the numbers with a predetermined conclusion in mind. I'm always trying to think of, well, what's another explanation? Because if I'm only going to go with whatever my preferred explanation is, I can fool myself. I can be wrong. So what's often happened is people have gone for whatever their preferred explanation is. And you should always be suspicious of that. Like, aha, the data confirmed what I want to think. Well, there may be alternative explanations to what you were thinking. So, consider. I mean, another potential, and I'm looking at this like, well, there were different patterns by state in terms of what mortality was in 2021 versus 2020, and so maybe COVID hit differently in 2021 versus 2020. Some states have more older people than others. Remember that peak of COVID occurred in January 2021, so a lot of those deaths came then. What if, you just didn't have as many old people in those places that it was spiking? So, there's some different kinds of explanations you can come up with. And you would have to think, well, how would I detect this? I'm just looking very high level at this data when I'm doing these graphs. So I want to start doing some comparisons by death rate. I did start you out with numbers of deaths, but the proper comparisons to do, especially over long periods of time, is comparing death rates. And I'm going to step you through the next few slides so that you understand what you're looking at. Okay. I know it's going to be difficult to see the differences in some of these. There is a narrative here, so you're going to have to trust me. Yes, I understand you can't see these 5 different colors. I have 2017 to 2021. The reason I'm having all of these is because I'm wanting to show you how close certain things are to each other over time, that there's small changes year over year in normal years, and how large the changes were in 2020, to 2020, and then 2021. Okay, so we're going to start off with the curve of what the death rates look like by these 5-year age groups. And I'm mainly going to want to look at how it goes to the older age groups. And if you're familiar with mathematical curves, the natural mortality curves tend to look like exponential graphs. This is something called the Gompertz-Makeham law, and it's especially past, let's just say past middle age, so say starting about age 40. In most developed countries, the mortality curves look like this. And we often complete our mortality tables using a formula fit, a functional fit to this Gompertz-Makeham form. So I'm doing this in 5-year buckets. And there's reasons why, and it's to smooth out data. There's some noise if I do it by 1-year buckets. And again, our rates per 100,000, so 2,000 is 2%. So that gives you an idea, starting at about age 70, the death rate is 2% and higher, and you can kind of see how it doubles, going up, so to 4%, to 8%, to 16% almost at age 85 plus, well, for year 2020. Okay, and this is coming from CDC Wonder. Okay, this is just regular old data. Now I'm going to go to the next graph, and it's going to be the same data, but it's going to look different. This is the exact same curve, but I've graphed it differently. If you look at the vertical scale, you'll see that it's marked 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. This is called a logarithmic scale. And why I use a logarithmic scale is because exponential curves look like straight lines when you use a logarithmic scale. So you can kind of see, yes, the curve looks funky for kids, but again, starting at about, age maybe 35, so around middle age, these curves start looking like straight lines. It kind of fits that Gompertz-Makeham. But now I want to point out, okay, This light green, yellow, and dark blue. Well, you can barely see it, but the light green, yellow, and dark blue are more or less on top of each other in this graph. They're almost essentially the same on this scale. And then you can see this light blue for 2020 is above the dark blue for almost all these ages. And then the red line, which is 2021, is above that for almost all these ages until you get to age 80. Does that sound familiar? So now we come to where I was trying to get you. And this is where I'm doing a percentage difference of all of these lines from 2019. So obviously the 2019 line is just going to be a straight line at 0%. Okay, because it's itself. There's no difference. That's 0% across. So let's look at what 2017 and 2018, the green and the yellow lines, look like. They kind of fluctuate around that 0 up and down. Okay, between plus 5%, maybe negative 3% or so. So I mentioned that 2019 was kind of a boring year, and it's a little bit better than 2017 and 2018 in a couple ways. So, but except there's something going on with the ages 35 to 44 and 10 to 14. But this gives you an idea of the fluctuations year to year. There's a couple differences. It's relatively small, and that gives you an idea. That's normal of how it changes year to year. But then we have these ginormous, that's the technical term, ginormous differences from 2019 to 2020, and especially 2021. And this is even with the 2021 numbers being provisional. Remember, all of these numbers are based off of real death certificates. So for 2021, those numbers can only go up. There can be only more deaths for 2021. But you can see that this 2021, these rates, especially look at 40 to 44, 50% higher mortality rate for age 40 to 44 in 2021 compared to 2019. That is amazing. In a 2-year period, having a mortality increase like that is just astounding. That's huge. For 2020, it's kind of interesting how across the board, it's about 20% for across a range of ages. And note that the mortality increase is kind of higher in this middle age range, actually most adult range, and it comes down a bit for the oldest adults. That's a little different. So some food for thought. Most people were thinking, COVID hits the oldest worst. Well, I didn't say this was only COVID. This is all-cause mortality. So that's what we will be getting into, the different causes of mortality. Because when you're only looking at COVID, and that's really what you're looking at the oldest ages, that's really like a 16% increase in mortality for most of the ages. There's other causes of mortality that are adding at especially the younger ages. And the issue is, while we're projecting mortality forward for some of these non-COVID causes, there's no real reason that they should stop, especially if it's not really COVID that's driving those causes of mortality to go up. So now we're going to look at cause of death. And one thing you need to think about in terms of cause of death, there's different codes, and all of the cause of death stuff I'm going to look at is based off of underlying cause of death. There is one and only one on each death certificate. There can be contributing causes of death. There are up to 20 of these on death certificates. I am not including these. Okay? This is just the underlying cause of death that I'm looking at. These come in big, broad categories. What I'm calling natural, physiological, stuff like heart disease, cancer, so natural causes of death, what you think of. There's external, so stuff like accidents, suicides, homicides. That's external causes of death. COVID, I mean, that's natural, but I'm splitting that off from natural. Investigation is actually external, but it has its special code, and I wanted to put that in red because I wanted to show you investigation is not differentiated. This has an effect when I do rates for homicide, suicide, and accidents, which are all the external ones. Investigation is just a big old pile of schmoo. It's just like, it's one of the external causes, but we're not telling you which one, or we don't know yet, because it takes a while to determine intent, whether it's suicide or homicide, or it was an unintentional. Think of, say, a drug overdose. You may take a while to determine whether it was a suicide or it was on purpose, or whether someone else did it and it was a homicide. But also, these are sensitive causes of death, and they censor that for 6 months. I want to break out external causes of death, and we'll look at these a little more closely in a later slide. They are small compared to natural and COVID, but they increased 18% just compared from April 2020 to July 2020, went up a lot. These were driven by drug overdoses and motor vehicle accidents specifically. Yes, homicides also went up, but suicides went down. And as I said, we will look at that. But homicides are actually a very low number, even though homicides did go up by over 30% in 2020. They're actually, in number, they're not a lot compared to motor vehicle accidents and drug overdoses. So let's just jump right into COVID as the cause of death. This obviously is very controversial. I'm going to make it clear once again, I'm only using underlying cause of death. I'm not doing the with COVID. This is the death certificates where it is the major cause of death. It's the one thing that's on the top. It's not contributing cause of death. Now, you may dispute with medical examiner whether it was the underlying cause of death. You take it up with medical examiners. I'm not a medical examiner. I'm an actuary. For contributing causes of death, and I do look at those as well, the thing that you need to know about that for people who get huffy, that, there's very few death certificates where COVID is the only cause of death listed on a death certificate. Well, that's true for basically all causes of death. There's very few death certificates that only have one cause of death listed on them. I've actually looked at it, and the number of causes of death listed on death certificates have been increasing. This is almost entirely due to the aging of the population. The older you are, the more likely you are to have comorbidities. High blood pressure, diabetes, all sorts of things that would contribute to your death. So it's not a big thing that there are comorbidities for COVID, that there are contributing causes of death, and you had COVID as your underlying cause of death. This is the one graph I'm going to show you that has some of the 2022 deaths in it. Most of the analyses I want to show you are going to be full year 2020 and 2021. The reason I wanted to show you this is I've grouped these by quarter, so 3 months at a time, so that you can see against 2019. And yes, most of this excess deaths, as it were, are COVID deaths. But yeah, every quarter we had a whole bunch of non-COVID deaths as well that were above the 2019, the same quarter. And we will look at the non-COVID deaths and those causes because they had a big impact on younger Americans. So once again, I'm going to show you the graph with the regular, what we call linear axis, but again, these are like our exponential curves. We really should look at this on a logarithmic axis. So here's our logarithmic axis. It's not exactly a straight line, almost a straight line for 2020, but this is what we want to look at. The rates for the ages up until, again, age 80, were lower in 2020 than 2021. So we see it was higher. And yes, this is Delta variant, Omicron, etc. And yes, this is the logarithmic scale. And yes, I'm ignoring the kids because this is boring. There's not much of anything going on. And yes, it's missing for 1 to 14, or I should say 1 to 9, because there's basically nothing going on there. Um, the, the numbers were so low in 2020, the CDC basically says it doesn't exist as a rate. That's why it's not on the graph. Anyway, so if you remember our graph of how the numbers of deaths, this is from all causes, okay, total number of deaths, first we subtract off the deaths from 2019, okay, so, okay, we had more deaths in 2021 for those under age 80. Then let's subtract off the COVID deaths, okay, difference in number of deaths by the 5-year age groups. So what percentage of the death difference is COVID? What do we have left to explain? So for those 85 and older, their excess, especially in 2021, especially when it goes over 100%, basically almost all their excess mortality for over age 85 is COVID. You don't really have anything else to explain. You can ignore that. So, okay, over age 85, COVID is it. From age 45 to 84, we have a COVID component that's over 50% both years, 2020 and 2021. Now, maybe we still need to explain the portion of excess mortality that's not COVID, especially if we're concerned it will continue even if COVID goes away. Now, COVID might not be going away, so we'd still have to be concerned about COVID. But if COVID goes away, maybe we don't have to worry about excess mortality for them so much. We really don't have to worry about the kids 10 and under. But from 10 to 44, there's a bunch of excess mortality that is not COVID. You know, it's less than 50% COVID. Whether it's natural, whether it's external, we've got to dig into that. Because even if COVID goes away, this other stuff might still be around. Now, maybe it's stuff that has to do with COVID policies. If that's the case, maybe it'll go away. Maybe it won't. So, again, from an actuary's point of view, these are things we have to worry about. So now we're going to dig into non-COVID causes of death. We're going to start with the big stuff. And it turns out we're not going to spend a lot of time with a lot of the big stuff. I actually pushed these back to 1999 just so you can see what some of the trends look like. These are going to be age-adjusted death rates, you know, just so you can see what the overall trend is, and it's not going to be influenced by the age distribution. And I did put COVID on here for scale. So you can see here's COVID, and it's below heart disease and cancer. So heart disease came down, went up a little bit in 2020, and kind of leveled off in 2021. But it's had a relatively good trend, and if I pushed it back before 1999, you will see it's been a very good trend for heart disease. It's really been coming down quite a bit. Cancer has been steadily improving, been coming down, down. It has not been improving as rapidly as heart disease. So if you look at these slopes, heart disease has really been coming down, and we were kind of hoping or expecting there to be a crossover between heart disease and cancer. It hasn't happened yet, but almost been anticipating it, because cancer has been slowly and steadily improving. Heart disease really stalled out recently, and there's a variety of reasons for that. We posit. In any case, cancer actually continued to improve a little bit in 2020, and does look like it stalled out in 2021. Okay, COVID, we saw what happened with COVID. Accidents is one that I really care about. It has a lot of stuff in there, and which really ticks me off. Motor vehicle accidents, which a lot of people expect, but also drug overdoses, and then also old people falling down and hurting themselves are also in accidents, and then little kids drowning and people horseplay and stuff like that. All sorts of things are in accidents. And that such disparate components are in this one cause of death really annoys me, because the nature of what's in there is so different, unlike with cancer and heart disease, for example, which, yeah, they have different heart disease due to smoking or cancer due to smoking versus just bad luck or genetics. Yeah, you could say, oh, those are different, but it's really different that someone died of an overdose versus someone is 85 years old and frail and slipped and fell. Those really are of a different nature in how you deal with those trends. I have thrown in some other major categories, and I'll just move by some of these really rapidly. I wanted to put some respiratory diseases together just so you could see scale-wise where these are, and these are all linear scales for you to look at the overall trend. These are not logarithmic, by the way. I use logarithmic scales when I'm doing age groups, and I'm doing linear scales for these time series so that you can see the time series trends. So flu and pneumonia has actually been improving, and chronic lower respiratory disease has been improving. Here's a few other major types of causes of death. Stroke has come down quite a bit. Alzheimer's is one of the causes that has been increasing. So a lot of causes of death have in general been decreasing. So stroke had been decreasing and it's kind of leveled off. Liver disease has been kind of going sideways and increased during the pandemic. We'll look at that. Diabetes increased. Alzheimer's is, as I said, has been generally increasing even before the pandemic. Here we go. We see these are the external causes of death, accidents. Suicide went down, though the numbers for 2021, that's accident, suicide, and homicide, those numbers are too low. Those are definitely coming up because I'm missing the numbers for November and December, at the very least. And some of the other numbers for the end of October are definitely not there, but there may be some other numbers missing. But homicide went up for 2020. Suicide definitely went down for 2020. Accidents went way up for 2020. I'm not going to look at all the physiological causes. Some of these are actually pretty boring. I'll just show you what some of these look like because I want you to get used to the pattern. Most of these, for physiological causes of death, you want to graph them using that log scale. So this is a log scale, and this is how most of these slides are going to look. A log scale for the death rates going, and here I have 2018 to 2021, and then I'm showing the 2020 and 2021 percentage differences so you can see them, how much they changed or didn't change as the case may be. They did go up. Some of that could be undiagnosed COVID. Some of it could be untreated heart disease during the pandemic. That's not a good thing. We don't know. Crank through a few others. Cancer is a little different from the other physiological causes. If we look at the percentages, we'll see that this scale is not quite so extreme. You should ignore the childhood cancer numbers because their rates are actually pretty low at childhood level. And they're really, percentage-wise, not a lot of differences at older ages. We haven't seen a lot of evidence yet, and this is, I've talked about this before, dying fast and dying slow. Cancer generally kills you slowly. There may be some effects from people not getting cancer screening during the pandemic, and of course, cancer is not being detected until later stages as a result. That said, again, cancer generally doesn't kill a lot of people rapidly. Usually it's very slowly over years. And, for those who have aggressive cancers, so the ones that kill them, it's a matter of timing. I'm just sorry about that. In some cases, you do get lucky and you are able to head off an aggressive cancer early on. In some cases, you just find a slow-growing cancer at a later stage and are able to get it at a later stage. That's it. Just to talk about flu and pneumonia for a moment, yeah, this has the quintessential, again, looks pretty linear when you graph it on a log scale. When you go middle age and older, we did see it go negative in 2021 and pretty positive in 2020. Again, that may be misdiagnosed COVID. And of course, it was going to be mainly pneumonia that it was being diagnosed as in 2020. Interestingly, in 2021, we barely got any flu detected at all. It was like a non-existent flu year. And it's not because they couldn't test for flu. They know how to test for flu, and they definitely were testing for flu, because I had my own kids were tested for flu when they also got tested for COVID at various times. And they were not detecting any flu viruses. Very, very weird. Diabetes had a bad trend in terms of 2020 and 2021. If we look at the percentage increases in death rate increases, and yes, this is one that looked really bad. Of course, it's coming up from a low rate for children, but even once you look at middle age and older, it was like 20% increase for diabetes deaths. And this is one where I think it was people not getting appropriately treated, people not getting seen by their doctors in 2020, definitely. It does seem that we just had some bad results during the pandemic of people not getting the medical treatment they needed for a chronic condition. And so that is bad news. And this is one of the weird ones, liver disease. This relates to the blog post I did to alcohol-related deaths. And if you look at the scale, this is a linear scale and not a logarithmic scale. This has a weird shape compared to the other curves, in that you have a lot of middle-aged people dying from liver disease. Yeah, because a lot of this is cirrhosis, and people are dying from this because they're alcoholics. And no, they don't die from this at 80 and 85, because they died from this when they were 60, being an alcoholic for decades, and they don't make it to age 80. If we look at the percentage difference, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, some people are dying of alcoholism during the pandemic. I mean, there's nothing more than I can tell you about this. And I call this physiological, but it's external. They're killing themselves with alcohol. So let's look at external causes. One of the causes, of course, that's of interest, and I'll note here on external causes, we're going to be using the linear scale for the vertical scale on all of these. Well, that's not totally true. I'll note it when we come to it when I go back to the logarithmic scale. Homicide is actually not a very large cause of death. Note, this is rate per 100,000, and the top number here is 20. 20 out of 100,000. To get to 1%, you need 1,000, and this doesn't even get to 100. So you'll notice this skews young. It has a peak at age 20 to 24, and it went up high in 2020. Remember, for these external causes of death, we don't have it broken out for November and December yet, so this 2021 curve is only going to go higher. It might exceed the 2020 numbers. We don't know yet. It's basically the same shape for 2021 as it is for 2020. So when we look at our numbers, we see how much higher, and we should probably, ignore, again, the children. Remember, these are the ones who died of this. This doesn't have anything to do with who committed the murders. We don't know. The death certificate doesn't record that. So comparing against 2019, we see this homicide rates, and again, it's like under age 40, these age 10 to about 39, the homicide, death by homicide increased over 30% for these age groups. It went up some for older adults as well, but it's mainly young adults who are getting killed, and of course it's probably young adults killing young adults. That's generally how it works. Suicide, on the other hand, actually went down in 2020. Now for 2021, again, the numbers aren't in for the full year. They may match for 2020. And note that for 2020, the numbers did go up for the oldest. And let's take a look at this. So we have suicide rates went up for the youngest and the oldest in 2020. And while it's negative in 2021, these may flip for, again, the youngest and the oldest, again, for 2021. Once we get those November and December numbers in, we don't know yet. But it is interesting for kind of the working age people in the middle that the suicide numbers went down. Don't know what to tell you about that. Accidents. Now we're back to the logarithmic scale. This is a very weirdly shaped curve, especially for a logarithmic scale. Why am I doing a logarithmic scale if it looks like this? Well, it's because there's a large component in here that has a curve that's similar to the physiological causes of death. And the cause that looks like a physiological cause of death is falls. It looks like a line when it's on a logarithmic scale, and if you think about what most falls are like, yeah, it's kind of like accidents at younger ages, people getting up on a ladder and painting a house and falling off the ladder. But at older ages, it really is a death of frailty in terms of most of the falls that kill people at older ages are, and why do you die? At a younger age, most people who fall don't die, okay? They are generally just fine if they fall. They're usually on, what kind of falls are killing people at older ages? They're usually on level ground. If you are at a younger age and you die from a fall, you're usually pretty high up. And these are supposed to be accidental falls, not suicides, not someone jumping to their death. Someone who accidentally falls, like you're rock climbing. You're rock climbing and you accidentally slip and fall, okay, from a high place. For someone who's 85 years or older, this is someone who's just kind of walking along on the sidewalk and just collapses, maybe, or falls, or is unsteady and just falls and, hits their head and dies. That's how it works. So it is it's almost like a physiological cause. And that's why it has that kind of shape. The percentage pattern is just all over the place. This one is what most people think about when I say accidental cause of death. And then we're back to the linear scale again. And this is motor vehicle accidents. So it's hard to trace, with these different lines crossing over each other. I'm going to move to the next graph and you can really see the pattern there. So let's look at 2020, which are the dark blue bars. Where is it positive and where is it negative for the dark blue bars? It's positive for age, let's see, about 10 to 64. And then over age 65, it's negative in 2020. So basically the seniors, the people who are retired, and kids, little kids who aren't going to school, they're stuck at home in 2020. They were locked down. They weren't going anywhere. So they didn't die in motor vehicle accidents. The people who had to go to Grubhub, who were Grubhub diners, who were drivers, who were Instacart drivers, they're the ones who dying in motor vehicle accidents, or they're driving like maniacs, etc., etc. It's a little, the numbers aren't coming through. Something's screwing up with PowerPoint. I'm sorry. These aren't graphing properly. But you're getting a similar pattern for 2021. And the one I'm going to close out on, and the one that's concerned me the most since the beginning of the pandemic, was something that had a bad trend before the pandemic. So motor vehicle accidents, traffic safety had actually been improving. It goes up and down, but in general, traffic safety had been improving. A lot of these causes of death had been improving, except for unintentional drug overdoses. That had been going up and down, got worse since 2015, primarily due to fentanyl, which is cheap. Its effective dose, as it were, is close to a killing dose. It's not necessarily addicts, but it's dealers who are lacing their supply with this cheap drug. Users can't really detect whether their drugs are adulterated with fentanyl. I mean, they think they're getting heroin or they think they're getting marijuana or something else, and the dealers are cutting the drugs they're selling, which are much more expensive than fentanyl, with this thing that gives a cheap, easy kick that can also kill their customers, which, I don't understand the business model. Okay. Anyway, moving on, you can see there's quite a bit of separation between these death rates for 2018 and 2019. And we kind of see the age band around which most of the deaths are occurring. So it's about age 25 to, about 64, where a lot of these drug ODs are occurring. When we look, and I really should have probably excluded the 15 to 19-year-old band. Yes, it's an over 100% increase on the death rate. Actually, let me go back here so you can see the 15 to 19. The 15 to 19, though, the death rate, it's down here. It's very small, and it did double, but it's very small compared to the older age groups. I probably should have started it at 20 to 24 for this graph so you could see the percentage increase. But for most of these, for 2020, we see increases of like 30% for most of these adult age groups. And then for 2021, these are only going to go up once we get the final numbers in, and it probably is about the same, if not higher, in 2021. And the issue we have here is, yes, some of it can be based on, well, you didn't have much else to do, or there was bailout funds coming to you, so what are you spending it on? Drugs! Just like there were some people who were spending their extra money on alcohol. Fine. They didn't have anything else. They couldn't go out. They couldn't really go party. So they spent it on, drugs and alcohol. Fine. I spent more on wine. Fine. And some people ended up killing themselves that way. That's one interpretation, but the problem is drug ODs already had a bad trend. There was already a fentanyl problem in the U.S. And when you look at SOA analyses of how the drug ODs are going, when they did it by like counties and socioeconomic profile, it's not just poor people or drugs of despair, which is the analysis when it was just oxy and people who were addicted to opioids. We have a fentanyl problem where people are ODing, and it's all socioeconomic levels where this is occurring. So for those who are trying to dismiss it, this is happening all over the place. It happens here in Westchester County, rich to poor, everywhere in between. And it's a problem, and it's not just a pandemic problem. So to move on, those are my notes. I will leave a link to the Dropbox so you can get a copy of the slides in PDF, in PowerPoint. All of the spreadsheets are in there as well. You can find me on Substack, marypatcampbell.substack.com. If you're interested, if you just want to look at the mortality stuff, there's a section that's called Mortality with Meep. I'm Meep. Mary Pat. Meep is my high school nickname, and I've been using it for decades since. So I'm Meep. Mortality with Meep, because there's stuff other than mortality on the blog, and maybe you're not interested in the non-mortality stuff, which is just fine. I'm also on LinkedIn if you want to send me a message. I'm on Twitter and other stuff, but it might be easiest to find me on LinkedIn and message me there if you want to ask questions or contact me in some way. So I hope this has cleared up some of the trends for you. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. You can also email me, marypat.campbell@gmail.com. Enjoy.